Perhaps like me, you've been in the habit of bouncing your audio clips in Studio One. And in a moment, I'm going to bounce this vocal track we can see here in blue. But before I do that, I just want us to take note of a few things. I'm going to start off by opening up my performance monitor by clicking down here. When that window opens, we can see that I'm using around about sort of 33% of the CPU. This is while it's idle. That may go up and down as I'm actually playing the track. The next thing I'd like us to take notice of is the fact that we can see all these kind of blue or light blue dots all over the event. And that's because I've used Melodyne to edit this vocal. If I select the event and then open my edit window, you can see the Melodyne changes down here. Another thing that I've changed that you can't see at the moment, but we can see if we right click and then show bend markers, is the fact that I've bent this audio a little bit. I've stretched it and contracted it in a few places. And all of that is being processed in real time as I play the track. In addition to that, I've made some changes to the gain envelope. So if I show that, you can see a few places where I've adjusted the gain. So all of that is being processed in real time. And I may choose to bounce this audio to, prevent that real-time processing. So I'll select the event, I'll press Control B on my keyboard. It'll take a few moments for this, but when it's done, you will see that the Melodyne edits have been applied permanently to this. And then if I right-click and show my bend markers and my gain envelope, that's no longer happening. That's been baked into the audio. Now, if we actually do take a look at the CPU performance again, you'll see in reality there's really been sort of not much change. We wouldn't see it anyway until we played the track, but basically we haven't actually gained much in terms of CPU performance. There may be other reasons why we may want to do this, to kind of have it as a committed clip, but we certainly wouldn't be saving much in CPU performance. Now, another thing about this that can be problematic is if I'm sort of regretting baking those things in, I do have a moment here to undo it. So if I press Control Z to undo it, then we can see that those changes have been undone. However, if I have committed that change, once I close this project and open it again, I won't be able to go back to my previous state unless I've saved it in another file, and that can be sort of a bit of a hassle in itself. So that's a couple of the reasons why you may choose to use Transform instead. This video is sponsored by DistroKid. Follow the VIP link in the description down below to get 7% off an already amazing price to distribute your music to the world. So before we dive into transforming this audio, it's important that we understand another couple of things that bouncing didn't do. We saw that when we bounced our track, all of those Melodyne edits were baked in, as well as any audio bending and gain changes. But one of the things it didn't take into account was automation. And if we open up the automation for this track, you'll see that I had some volume automation here towards the end. So it didn't bake that into the audio. That's still being applied in real time after our bounce. And that's true for all automation. The other thing that it didn't take into account was any inserts that we had on the track. So if we look over here on the left, we can see I've got 4 inserts on this track. And I want to focus on one in particular. The first one is called Tape Machine 80. It's from IK Multimedia, and I absolutely love this effect. However, it's very CPU intensive. If I open up my performance monitor here and then we look at that CPU monitor, remember it's around about 34%. If I turn this plugin off, if I bypass it, look at the big drop in the CPU. It by itself is using like half of the CPU performance. So that has not been taken into account when we bounce the audio. And that's going to become important as we learn about transforming audio. So this time, rather than bounce this audio, I'm going to go over to the track itself, right click on it, and then go down to transform to rendered audio. Now we've got a couple of choices in this dialog box here. The first is preserve real-time state. This is going to enable us to go back to this current state in the future should we want to. We'll talk about that in a moment. The other option, auto tail, basically will extend the length of this event by whatever amount of time we've got in here to take into account sort of long tails from reverbs or delays or something like that. I don't see many reasons why you shouldn't just leave both of those on all of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. Now, it does take a fair amount longer to transform this audio than it does to simply bounce it. So I'm going to speed up the video. So now that it's transformed that audio, we can see that it's made some of the same changes that bouncing would have done. So for example, the Melodyne edits are now baked into this audio. As well as that, if we right click here and turn on bend markers and the gain envelope, we can see all of those changes have been baked in as well. In addition to this, however, it's also baked in any automation. If we open up our automation for this track, we can see that there's no longer that volume automation we had here at the end. But if you look carefully at the waveform, you can see it gets quieter and quieter. So it's actually been baked into the audio. And then finally, I'd like to take a look at the CPU performance. If we open up our performance monitor, you can see that rather than sitting at 33 or 34%, it's sitting at around about 14 to 15%. So that's quite a lot of gain there in terms of CPU performance. And that's largely been achieved because it also baked in any insert effects that we had. So you can see over here on our inserts, it's now empty. All of those plug-in effects have been baked into the audio. Now that may seem pretty scary to you. However, it's super easy to get them back. If we right click and go to transform to real-time audio, it's going to undo all of those changes. We can see all of those plugins are back. We can change them. All of our Melodyne edits are back, etc. And this will even be true after we've closed down our session. This is not an undo type feature. It's always going to be there at our disposal. Now, before you rush off and start transforming everything into rendered audio, there are a few quirks that we need to discuss. As well as that, I think it's worth taking a look at the benefits of transforming instruments into rendered audio. We'll look at all of that after I've reminded you that if you're releasing your music to places like Spotify, Amazon, Google Play, etc., check out the VIP link down below to our sponsor DistroKid. If you follow that link, you'll get 7% off of your first year of membership. So something you may have noticed is that before I transformed my audio here, it was a mono source, and then after I transformed it, it became stereo, as you can see here. Now the reason for that is, as well as taking into account things like volume and volume automation, it also takes into account any panning you had applied. Previously, if we take a look at my mono track, yes, it's mono, but it was panned ever so slightly over to the right. Now, you can't easily see it here, but the right channel is slightly louder than the left channel once we've transformed the audio, and that's because of that panning. Another thing you may notice between bouncing and audio transformation is that it doesn't join our events together. If we'd had two events previously and transformed the audio, they would remain as two events. However, with bouncing, if we take a look, for example, at this guitar track here, and I select these two events and then press Control B to bounce them, they become one event afterwards. So that's worth taking into account. Now, the other thing I want to point out is there's no sort of double dipping. What do I mean by that? So let's say I've got my transformed audio here. Remember, all of the effects that I used to have as inserts over here have now been baked in. but I can now apply other effects to this. So let's say I want to put in this plate reverb as an effect on here. That will now be applied, as well as all the other effects that were previously baked into the audio. However, if I now go ahead and transform this to rendered audio like so, it'll take a moment or two. Now that I've got that reverb baked in, yes, I can go back to transform to real-time audio like so, and you can see my reverb plug-in there, but I cannot transform to I cannot go back to a previous state again from there. So no double dipping with this. So with instrument tracks, we can either bounce them or we can transform them into rendered audio as well. We're going to be doing both to the drums that we can see here. But before we do, let's take note of the fact we can see the drums MIDI here, and it's being applied to this virtual instrument, Addictive Drums 2. Another thing I'd like you to note is that if we look at this instrument down here and expand it, we're using several outputs, one for the master, one for the kick, one for the snare, and one for the hi-hat. And if we go ahead and look in the console at the snare over here, we can see that we also have an insert effect applied to it. So let's start off by bouncing this instrument. I will click on the event itself and I'll press Ctrl B on my keyboard to bounce it. Now that that's done, we can see that it's created a whole new audio track here in stereo, and that is the stereo output of the drums. Then we've actually kept the original MIDI here, as well as the instrument, which is down here, but it's simply muted the event so that we can no longer hear it. But basically everything's still in place, and we've just got an additional stereo track. It's very different if we use the transform to rendered audio features. So let's undo the bounce that we did, and I'll right click on this track and go down to transform to audio track like so. Now we get a few more options here than we did when we use this with audio. First of all, we get the option to render all of the channels. So remember, we've got these separate outputs. This is going to render them separately so we can still mix each of those drums afterwards. We've also got the ability to include any inserts, so that's going to include the reverb that we have applied to the snare, if you remember. And then it's also going to preserve the instrument track state. This means that we can go back to our current state in the future if we want to. Now, it can also remove the instrument from memory. That frees up resources. And then finally, we have the same auto tail options that we had before. So let's go ahead and click on OK. So in my opinion, now this is done, we end up with a much better result. We've got all of our separate tracks here. So we've got audio for the master output, we've got it for the kick, for the snare, and for the hi-hat. And to save some resources, it's baked in that reverb that we had applied to the snare. And if we look down here at our instruments, it's also been removed from memory here, so we can free up some resources. But the great thing is all is not lost. If we need to go back to our original state, we can right click and then click on transform to instrument track, and it'll put everything back as we had it before. So personally, I'm going to be trying to break the bouncing habit and transforming to rendered audio quite a lot more. How about you? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm Mike. I hope you're well, and I'll see you in the next video.